I have buried people whose bodies were never found, and the earth still answers me when I walk over where they vanished. Uh, I'm recording this because my hands won't stop shaking, and because if I don't put it somewhere outside my head, I'm going to start believing the forest deserves what it's doing to me. I've been a federal ranger for almost 17 years. Search and rescue, backcountry enforcement, wildfire patrols, winter closures. I chose this job because I wanted rules, boundaries, maps that made sense. I wanted to believe that if you learned the land well enough, it would stop surprising you. That was before the missing started stacking in my memory like cordwood. The first disappearance I was ever assigned to wasn't dramatic. A solo hiker, late 40s, decent gear, last ping near a trailhead that looped back to itself. We searched for 8 days. Dogs refused to go past a certain bend in the creek. Helicopters saw nothing. When the snow came early, the case went cold. Officially, it's unresolved. Unofficially, it lives in my chest. I still hear the way his wife asked me if the forest ever gives people back. I told her, yes, I lied. This particular district doesn't have a name people recognize. No famous park signage, no gift shops. It's the kind of place you only enter if you're supposed to be there or if you're already running from something else. Mountains folded over each other like old scars. Abandoned logging roads that disappear into alder thickets. Mines from a century ago that were sealed and resealed and marked and unmarked again as records were lost. There are zones on our internal maps that are simply gray, labeled unstable, which is a word that can mean anything from landslides to things we're not allowed to discuss. The calm began in late spring, when the snowmelt made everything loud and alive. Rivers talking over themselves, wind in the canopy, birds arguing about territory. It felt like a relief after winter. I told myself the dread I carried was just the hangover from too many years of bad endings. Then the radio started misbehaving. At first it was interference, bursts of static where a voice should be, not unusual in steep terrain, but the static began to shape itself. I could swear there were syllables buried inside it, rising and falling with breath. One afternoon while checking a backcountry permit station, I heard my own name come through the speaker. It was faint, stretched thin, like it had traveled a long way through dirt. I keyed the mic and asked for a repeat. The channel went dead. When it came back, a different ranger was asking why I'd just called for help. I didn't file a report. I told myself it was crosstalk, equipment fatigue. I have always been good at explaining things away. It's how you survive in this job. The second disturbance was physical. A cold front pushed through in June, sudden and wrong. Frost on the grass at dawn, the temperature dropped so fast my breath fogged inside my truck. When I stepped out, the air smelled burned, like hair singed too close to a flame. There were tracks in the mud near the road pullout, but they didn't resolve into anything recognizable. Just impressions, deep and irregular, as if something heavy had paused there and then decided against continuing. I followed them longer than I should have. They led off the road across ground that sloped gently downward toward a stand of trees so tightly packed there shouldn't have been room for anything larger than a deer. Halfway there, the forest went quiet. Not the natural hush of animals freezing at a predator's presence, but a pressure, like cotton stuffed into my ears. I could feel my heartbeat in my jaw. The smell intensified, sulfur and wet fur and something sweet underneath that made my stomach turn. I stopped because the ground began to vibrate. Not an earthquake, too localized. A low tremor that came in pulses, as if something below was shifting its weight. I told myself it was water moving through rock. I turned around and went back to the truck. When I looked over my shoulder, the trees behind me were closer than they had been a moment before. I don't mean I misjudged the distance. I mean the space had changed. I felt it in my knees. That night I dreamed of tunnels. I was underground, crawling through something that breathed. The walls were metal in places, stone in others, stitched together with old timbers and bolts that hummed softly. Voices came from behind the walls, calling for help in tones that matched the missing people's case files I'd read for years. When I woke up, my sheets were damp with sweat and my chest felt bruised, like something had been sitting there. The next morning, a call came in about a hunter who hadn't checked out at his designated time. I volunteered to take point. That's not bravery. That's guilt. I needed to believe I could still find someone alive. His truck was where it should have been. Engine cold. Coffee cup half full. No sign of struggle. The trail he'd taken wasn't official. An old spur used by locals running along a ridgeline toward a series of sealed mine entrances. We weren't supposed to open those without authorization. I could feel that fact pressing against the inside of my skull as I followed his boot prints. They stopped abruptly at a clearing that shouldn't exist. The map showed trees. The ground showed bare earth, scraped clean down to clay. In the center, there was a depression, perfectly round, about 10 feet across. The air above it shimmered, heat waves bending the light even though the day was cool. When I stepped closer, my radio crackled to life. "Help me," a voice said. It was his voice. I knew because I'd listened to the voicemail he left his wife before he left home. I backed away. The smell came back, burnt hair, blood in snow that wasn't there. My boots felt heavy like they were sticking to the ground. I could hear breathing behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing. Trees too narrow to hide anything, shadows that didn't belong to the sun's angle. I reported the location as a sinkhole risk and marked it for follow-up. Another lie, this one official. The search was called off 2 days later due to weather that never arrived. After that, the forest began to behave like it was paying attention to me. Trails rerouted themselves subtly, markers I'd placed vanished overnight. Reflections in streams lagged behind my movements by half a second. Once, while crossing a frozen lake in July, ice where there should have been water, I saw figures standing beneath the surface, motionless, staring up as if waiting for me to fall through. I started hearing things beneath the soil. Not constantly, just enough to make me question whether it was happening at all. Knocking, scraping, a steady, patient rhythm, like someone testing for weak spots. At night, in the ranger cabin, the metal walls whispered as they cooled, and sometimes the whispers aligned into words. "You're already here. I haven't told anyone about the cave yet. The one I found behind the old fire lookout, hidden by a rock slide that wasn't there last season. The one that smells like decay coming from a place that looks clean. The one my dreams have been mapping for me, inch by inch. I know better than to go alone. I also know I will. I didn't tell anyone about the cave because once something is written down, it becomes real in a way that can't be negotiated with. Reports trigger responses. Responses bring people, and whatever was under that mountain had already proven it could decide who was noticed and who wasn't. The entrance was wrong. That's the simplest way to say it. Not wrong like dangerous or unstable, wrong like it violated the idea of how spaces are supposed to exist. The rock slide that hid it looked old, lichen-covered, settled, but the gap behind it was clean-edged, as if the stone had been parted deliberately and recently. No debris trail, no scrape marks, just an opening tall enough to stand in, breathing out air that was warmer than the forest, carrying that same burned, sweet stench that clung to the back of my throat. I stood there for a long time, hand on the flashlight, arguing with myself. I listed rational explanations the way I'd been trained. Geothermal vent, forgotten prospecting tunnel, animal den magnified by erosion. Each explanation collapsed under the weight of how familiar the place felt. My dreams had been rehearsals. I knew where the first bend would be. I knew the ceiling would lower just enough to make me hunch. I knew there would be metal embedded in stone, humming softly like a distant power line. When I stepped inside, the forest sounds cut off as if someone had closed a door behind me. The tunnel sloped downward, gentle at first, then steeper. The walls alternated between rough-hewn rock and sections reinforced with timbers so old they had petrified, grain lines sharp as if freshly cut. There were bolts in the metal panels, their heads worn smooth by hands, human hands. I could tell by the pattern of wear, the way fingertips had traced the same arcs over and over. My radio crackled. I turned it off. The further I went, the more the temperature climbed. Sweat ran down my spine. Somewhere ahead, water dripped in a slow, deliberate cadence. I tried to count the seconds between drops to ground myself. The count kept changing. Sometimes the drops overlapped, echoing in ways that suggested multiple chambers opening and closing their throats. I found the first sign of habitation where the tunnel widened into a room that had once been a junction. Rusted rails ran along the floor, disappearing into collapsed side passages. In the center, there was a table, not improvised, manufactured. Its surface was scarred with knife marks and burn circles. On it lay a ranger badge. Mine. I picked it up with hands that didn't feel like they belonged to me. The serial number was correct. The scratches along the edge matched damage from a fall I'd taken years ago. This wasn't a copy. It was a memory, solid and cold against my palm. "That's not possible," I said out loud, because silence was pressing in on me, thick and attentive. Something moved in the corner of the room. I swung the flashlight. The beam caught a figure standing flush against the wall, motionless. For a heartbeat, I thought it was a trick of shadow. Then it blinked. It had my face, arranged incorrectly. The eyes were set too far apart. The mouth smiled a fraction too late, as if responding to a cue I couldn't hear. When it spoke, the voice was mine, but stripped of breath, flattened. "You came back," it said. I fired my sidearm before I realized I was pulling the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet sparked against metal and ricocheted into darkness. When the ringing in my ears subsided, the figure was gone. The wall behind it was bare stone, unmarred. I laughed then, a short, broken sound that hurt my throat. Hallucination. Stress response. Carbon monoxide, maybe. Anything. The tunnel beyond the junction narrowed, forcing me into a crouch. The floor vibrated beneath my knees, a low-frequency hum that resonated in my bones. I felt it in my teeth. The air tasted metallic now, like blood held in the mouth too long. Occasionally, side passages branched off, their entrances sealed with plates bolted from the inside. Names were scratched into the metal. Dates. Some recent, some old enough that the script had become stylized, ritualistic. I recognized one of the names. A ranger from another district who'd gone missing 5 years ago. Officially, he'd fallen into a ravine. His body was never recovered. "Help me," someone whispered from behind the plate. I didn't stop. That's another truth I have to live with. The tunnel opened into something that had never been on any map. A cavern vast enough that my flashlight couldn't find the ceiling. The floor dropped away into a pit filled with water, so still it reflected the walls like a mirror. The reflections were wrong. The shapes above didn't match what my light revealed. Figures stood along the edges in the water image, their outlines wavering, heads tilted as if listening. The smell was overwhelming here. Wet fur, decay, clean stone layered over rot. Heat radiated from the pit, fogging my glasses. I wiped them with shaking fingers and saw movement on the far side. Structures, maybe. Bunkers built into the rock, their doors hanging open. Inside, lights flickered, powered by something I couldn't see. As I watched, one of the figures in the reflection raised its arm. I felt the touch on my ankle then. A brush, light and exploratory like fingers testing fabric. I kicked and stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs. There was nothing there. No hand, no ripple in the water. Just the hum, deepening as if pleased. Memories began to surface that weren't mine to have. Faces of people I'd searched for, standing in places I'd never been. Voices explaining calmly how the land had asked them to stay, how it had promised to remember them if they agreed to become part of it. I clutched my head and screamed for it to stop, the sound swallowed instantly by the cavern. The ground shuddered. From the pit, something rose, not fully, just enough to break the surface tension of the reflection. I couldn't see it directly. My eyes slid off it, refusing to focus, but I could feel its attention like weight on my chest, an invisible cold pressure that made breathing an effort. "You keep our records," it said, without sound. "We keep ours." I understood then that the disappearances weren't accidents. They were transactions, some willing, some not. Witnesses were variables to be controlled. Memory was the currency. The land remembered every scream because it needed to, because forgetting would mean hunger. I don't remember how I left the cavern. I remember crawling. I remember the walls closing in, metal whispering encouragement, using my voice, my cadence. I remember heat giving way to sudden frost, my breath crystallizing in front of me in the middle of summer. When I emerged into daylight, I vomited until there was nothing left but bile and the taste of iron. The cave entrance was gone, solid rock where the gap had been, no sign of disturbance. They reassigned me a week later. Administrative decision, performance concerns. I didn't argue. I packed my things from the cabin, my hands steady now, too steady. At night, wherever I sleep, I hear knocking beneath the floor. Testing, patient. I know they're waiting for me to finish this confession. I know that once I do, there will be nothing left anchoring me to the surface. They came for me the way weather comes, without urgency, without malice, certain of arrival. After the reassignment, I tried to live as if geography alone could save me. New district, new cabin, different trees. I told myself land is land, and whatever I'd encountered was localized, an anomaly stitched to a specific fault line or forgotten project. That belief lasted until the first night I heard the ground breathe again. It started as a vibration under the bed, subtle enough to pass for a distant truck. Then the rhythm emerged. Inhale, exhale, slow and deliberate. The temperature in the room spiked. Sweat broke out across my shoulders. The air smelled wrong. Clean pine layered over something ancient and spoiled like rot sealed in plastic. I lay there, eyes open, listening to my own pulse, trying to outrun the sound beneath the floorboards. I counted breaths. Mine. The houses. When I couldn't tell them apart anymore, I got up and turned on every light. The mirrors were the next thing to go. Not all at once, just delayed. I'd move my hand and the reflection would hesitate before following, as if waiting for permission. Once, brushing my teeth, I watched myself smile when I hadn't. The expression held too long, stretching the skin around the eyes. When I blinked hard, it corrected itself. I laughed it off in the moment. Later, I couldn't remember what my face had looked like before. I stopped sleeping. In the absence of rest, memories blurred. I'd be driving a patrol route and suddenly realize I'd already passed the same marker 3 times. The forest reorganized itself subtly, not enough to alarm, just enough to disorient. Sounds carried incorrectly. A bird call from the wrong species. Footsteps matching my pace when I was alone. I reported none of it. Paranoia took root. I became convinced other rangers knew. That they were watching me with a kind of professional sympathy. The way you look at someone whose terminal diagnosis has been confirmed but not yet disclosed. Conversations would stall when I entered a room. Radios would go quiet. Once I caught someone tracing a symbol into the dust on a truck hood. 3 interlocking arcs, like a topographic map, folded into itself. When I asked what it meant, he wiped it away without answering. The dreams returned, more insistent. No longer rehearsals, but instructions. They showed me entrances I hadn't seen before. A culvert beneath a washed-out road, a storm drain behind an abandoned visitor center, a freezer-cold lake at elevation, its surface unbroken, its depth whispering promises. Each dream ended the same way. Me standing at the threshold, knowing exactly how to step inside without resistance. I started leaving notes for myself. Ground rules, reality checks, dates, times, observations written in ink, so I could trace them later and confirm continuity. One morning, I woke to find an additional note in my handwriting that I did not remember writing. You agreed once. You just don't remember yet. The smell of burnt hair clung to the paper. The final call came on a Tuesday, mid-afternoon. Missing persons. 2 teenagers, last seen near a decommissioned military installation buried deep in the restricted zone. Officially, it was a listening post from the Cold War. Unofficially, it had been sealed after something went wrong underground. I knew the place. Everyone did. We weren't supposed to talk about it. I volunteered before anyone else could speak. The road had collapsed years ago. I hiked the last mile through forest that felt rehearsed, every branch positioned just so. The silence returned as I crossed an invisible boundary. No wind. No insects. Even my footsteps sounded absorbed, as if the ground were padded. The entrance hatch was open. That alone told me there would be no rescue, no escalation. This wasn't an emergency. It was an appointment. Inside, the air was frigid. Frost rimed the metal walls despite the summer heat outside. My breath came out in white plumes. The corridor sloped downward, lights flickering on as I passed, powered by something still alive after all these years. The hum was familiar now, comforting in a way that made my stomach churn. Voices echoed from deeper in, overlapping, not screaming, conversational, calm. I recognized tones, rangers, locals, people I'd never met but somehow knew, the sound of a community assembled below the earth. The teenagers' backpacks lay neatly against the wall near a junction, shoes placed side by side, no blood, no signs of struggle, a voluntary arrangement. I followed the voices. The bunker opened into a chamber larger than the cavern I'd fled before. Its walls layered with different eras of construction, stone, concrete, steel, each built around the last like rings in a tree. Along the perimeter, alcoves housed figures standing motionless, eyes open, breathing shallowly. Some were young, some were impossibly old. Their skin bore the marks of the land, lichen patterns, mineral staining, veins like root systems. At the center, the pit waited, not water this time, but darkness so dense it bent light inward. Heat rolled off it in waves, then receded, replaced by biting cold. The environment couldn't decide which version of itself to wear. "You came back," the voice said again. "Not from one place, but everywhere." I stepped forward because there was nowhere else to go. The ground vibrated under my boots, matching my heartbeat. Invisible pressure settled on my chest, heavy and intimate. Memories flooded me then, realigned, recontextualized. The first disappearance, the dog stopping at the creek, the way the earth had felt soft under my knees when I knelt there. I remembered agreeing, not consciously, not verbally, but with a part of myself I'd never acknowledged. A ranger's bargain, to keep walking, to keep looking, to keep feeding the record. "We don't take," it said. "We preserve." I saw myself in the alcoves, multiplied, different ages, different choices, all of them tired, all of them still listening. I understood what becoming part of it meant. Not death, not exactly. Continuity. Awareness stretched thin across stone and soil, the land remembering through borrowed minds. The teenagers stood at the edge of the pit, hands clasped, faces blank with awe. I wanted to warn them. The words died in my throat. I could feel the forest leaning in, eager, patient. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had lost relevance. Eventually, something shifted, a misalignment. Maybe my refusal, however weak, mattered. Maybe the system requires dissent to function. The pressure eased, just enough for me to stagger back. "You will finish the record," it said. "Then you can rest." I woke up on the surface at dawn, frost melting off my jacket. The bunker hatch was sealed. No sign of the teenagers. No radio traffic. No urgency. This recording is the last thing I'm allowed to do on my own terms. I can feel the pull now, constant and low, like gravity recalibrated. When I stand on soil, it hums. When I lie down, it breathes with me. If you've found this, if you're listening, understand this. Some places are not dangerous because they are wild. They are dangerous because they are organized, because they keep accounts, because they answer back. I am finishing this because the pull has stopped pretending to be subtle. It's everywhere now, not just underfoot, but behind my eyes in the pause between thoughts. When I close my mouth, my teeth hum. When I stand still long enough, the ground adjusts to me like it's finding the correct frequency. I understand finally why so many of the missing were found sitting or lying down, bodies arranged neatly, faces calm. They weren't overwhelmed, they were tuned. After the bunker, I tried to resign. Paperwork vanished from the system. Emails bounced back unsigned. My supervisor avoided my eyes and spoke to me like I was already gone. When I insisted, he slid a thin folder across the desk. No markings, no letterhead. Inside were photographs I didn't remember taking. Caves, tunnels, junction rooms, alcoves filled with people standing perfectly still, eyes open, waiting. One photo showed me among them. I stopped driving. Roads began looping. delivering me back to trailheads I hadn't intended to visit. The forest closed ranks around my cabin. Trees leaned in directions they hadn't before. Roots surfaced overnight, forming ribs in the soil. At dusk, silhouettes appeared at the edge of my vision and held their shape even when I stared directly at them. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They waited. Sound became unreliable. Sometimes I heard radios murmuring from miles away, voices traveling through stone. Sometimes the silence pressed so hard it felt like my eardrums would rupture. Once in that silence, I heard my own breathing come from behind me, perfectly synced but half a second delayed. I stopped checking mirrors altogether. The dreams shifted again. Not instructions now, but memories being handed back incorrectly. I would dream of childhood places I'd never been, parents with unfamiliar faces, a version of myself who had never left the ground. In these dreams, the land was not hostile, it was intimate. It held me the way water holds a diver, firm, inescapable, oddly gentle. I woke each time with the smell of wet fur and clean stone in my nose. The final sign came as a courtesy, a warning shaped like permission. I found the entrance at dawn, 3 miles from the cabin, where no entrance had ever been. The earth there had folded inward, revealing a stairwell carved directly into bedrock. No supports, no railings, just steps worn smooth by traffic that had no business existing. Warm air flowed up from below, carrying that familiar layered scent, decay and order, rot and cleanliness, the impossible coexistence of both. I stood at the top for a long time, recorder in hand, aware that this was the last moment I could still choose to run. I didn't. Each step down felt like recognition. The pressure on my chest eased the deeper I went, replaced by a spreading warmth that settled into my bones. The walls vibrated gently, not with machinery, but with presence. I brushed my fingers along the stone and felt a response, like skin tightening under touch. Voices rose around me, not calling, not pleading, conversing, exchanging observations, recording. I understood then that the land wasn't feeding on people the way predators feed. It was archiving us, using nervous systems the way we use notebooks. Consciousness was a resource. Memory was structure. The stairwell opened into a chamber that made the bunker feel provisional. This place was older. No seams, no mixed materials, just stone shaped with intent so refined it felt grown rather than built. The ceiling arched high above, threaded with veins of mineral that glowed faintly, pulsing in slow waves that matched the hum I'd been hearing for months. Figures stood throughout the space, some embedded halfway into the walls, others freestanding, all connected by that shared rhythm. Their eyes tracked me as I entered, not individually but collectively, like facets of a single attention. At the center was an opening, not a pit this time, but a passage descending further, its edges soft, unfinished, as if still being decided. "You're late," the voice said, using no sound at all. I tried to speak. What came out wasn't language, just breath shaped by vibration. It seemed satisfied. Memories I hadn't lost but had been carrying incorrectly were adjusted. I saw the first disappearance again and understood why the dogs stopped. The ground there had already been listening. I saw every search I'd led from below, felt the footfalls overhead like rain. I felt the moments when people crossed the threshold without realizing it. The precise instant curiosity outweighed fear. I saw the rangers before me, generations of them, each believing they were containing something, managing risk, when in fact they were being managed. The job had never been to protect people from the wilderness. It had been to regulate access, to ensure the right number of witnesses, to keep the balance between surface and below. The guilt I'd carried loosened its grip, not erased, recontextualized. Guilt is a surface emotion. Down here, it becomes something else. Utility. I was guided, not physically, but with certainty, toward the central passage. The temperature fluctuated wildly as I approached, a wave of heat, like standing too close to a fire, then a plunge so cold my breath crystallized instantly. My body struggled to keep up. The environment was testing thresholds, calibrating. At the edge, I hesitated. This is the part I don't have language for, because language depends on distance, and there was none left. The pressure that had haunted me for months settled fully onto my chest, not crushing, but aligning. My heartbeat slowed until it matched the hum. The boundary between my thoughts and the surrounding stone thinned to transparency. I understood what rest meant, not sleep, not death, a redistribution. I felt myself stretch, not physically, but perceptually, threading into the rock, into the tunnels, into the listening cavities scattered across the range. I felt hikers take footsteps days before they arrived. I felt storms gathering beyond the horizon. I felt the subtle signatures of fear and curiosity that determined who would pass through unnoticed and who would be invited to stay. I am still here enough to finish this recording because finishing matters. Records must close. Loops must complete. If you are listening to this and you work in the wilderness, ranger, surveyor, contractor, volunteer, pay attention to the moments when the land seems to respond too precisely, when paths rearrange themselves, when silence feels deliberate, when you smell decay in places that look untouched. Do not assume you are alone just because no one is watching. Some places are not empty. They are full beyond capacity. This is the last part. There will be no further continuation. If the ground hums when you stand still, if the forest answers back, do not follow it unless you are prepared to become part of the record. The first night I understood that the forest did not belong to us was the night the trees stopped sounding like trees. My name doesn't matter the way you might think it does, but for the sake of honesty, I'll give you what I've always given my supervisors and the locals who asked too many questions. I was 36 years old when this started. Old enough to trust my judgment, young enough to believe experience still meant safety. I had been a forest ranger for over a decade, assigned to a stretch of protected land most people only knew as a green smear on a map, mountainous, dense, and old in a way that defied human timelines. The locals called it by another name, one they rarely said out loud. They called it a listening place. I laughed the first time I heard that. I worked out of a small ranger station tucked between pines so tall they erased the sky by mid-afternoon. The building smelled of dust, wet paper, and old coffee. Radios crackled more often than they spoke. My job was simple on paper: patrol trails, check permits, assist lost hikers, investigate reports of animal activity, and close off areas deemed unsafe. I believed in rules, procedures, and the idea that nature, no matter how vast, could be understood if you paid attention long enough. That belief was the first thing the forest took from me. The people who lived nearest the boundary were polite but guarded. They fixed your truck if it broke down. They nodded when you passed them on the road. But when you asked about certain trails, certain caves, certain disappearances logged decades ago, their eyes shifted, their voices lowered. And they would say the same thing, almost word for word, as if rehearsed. Some places don't want to be found. I chalked it up to folklore. Every forest has its stories. Every mountain has its warnings disguised as superstition. I had handled mountain lions, black bears, meth cooks, and men who got lost on purpose because they didn't want to go home. Fear, I believed, always had a source you could identify. That changed during a late autumn patrol, when the air was sharp enough to sting and the ground crunched under my boots like breaking bones. It started with a call about a missing hiker. Male, mid-40s, experienced. He had signed in at a trailhead that hadn't seen traffic in weeks and never signed out. Weather had been clear, no distress beacon, no signs of injury reported. Just gone. I followed the protocol. I logged my route. I notified dispatch. I took the trail slow, scanning for broken branches, disturbed soil, anything that suggested panic or injury. The forest was quiet in a way I couldn't quite place. No birds, no wind. Even my breathing sounded intrusive, like I was violating some unspoken rule. About 3 miles in, I found his pack. It was upright, leaning carefully against a tree, zippers closed, straps tucked in neatly. That alone made my skin crawl. Lost hikers don't leave their packs like that. Injured hikers don't either. They drop them. They spill things. They make messes. This pack looked placed. I radioed it in, my voice steady, professional. I told myself maybe he went exploring, maybe he panicked and thought he could move faster without the weight. I told myself a lot of things, all of them reasonable, all of them hollow. That was when I heard the sound. It came from deeper in the woods beyond the trail, low and rhythmic. Not a growl, not a call, more like breathing, but too slow, too deliberate. Each inhale dragged, each exhale wet and heavy, as if whatever made it had lungs built for something larger than air. I froze. Years of training tell you not to run, not to shout, not to let fear dictate your movement. Identify, assess, respond. I rested my hand near the radio, my eyes moving between the trees. The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had. I waited a full minute before moving again, every sense stretched tight. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were not human. They were not animal in any configuration I recognized. Too wide, too deep. Each impression pressed into the soil as if the ground itself had yielded reluctantly. 5 toes, no claws. The stride was long, longer than my own by half. I remember laughing then, a short, sharp sound that surprised me. My brain rejected what my eyes were seeing and filled the gap with denial. A prank, a hoax, locals trying to scare a ranger. That explanation felt safer than the alternative. I followed the prints. They led off the trail, downhill toward a rocky outcrop I knew well. There was a cave there, not officially marked, not open to the public. We had sealed it years ago after a collapse killed a climber, or at least that's what the report said. The air changed as I approached it, cooler, damp. It carried a smell I couldn't place at first, like wet stone mixed with something organic, something old. My radio crackled, then went dead. I told myself that was normal. Terrain interference. I told myself a lot of things. Inside the cave, the light faded fast. My headlamp cut a narrow path through the dark, illuminating walls scratched with long, uneven marks. Not claw marks, not tool marks. They were irregular, as if made by hands that didn't quite understand their own strength. That was when the fear started to shift. Up until then, it had been external, a thing to be managed, a variable. But standing there, deep underground, with the weight of the mountain pressing down and the knowledge that I was alone in a place no one checked anymore, the fear turned inward. I thought about the locals, about their silence, about the missing hiker's pack, placed like an offering. I thought about all the times I had ignored my instincts because paperwork demanded proof. The breathing started again, closer this time. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might echo. The sound wasn't coming from ahead of me. It was coming from behind the walls, from the rock itself, reverberating through stone and bone alike. Something moved in the dark beyond my light. I didn't see it clearly. I still can't describe it without my mind trying to soften the edges. Tall, broad, covered in something that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. When it shifted, the air displaced around it like a living thing reacting to a larger presence. I ran. I broke every rule I had ever followed and ran, boots slipping on damp stone, lungs burning, fear finally unchained. I didn't look back. I didn't shout. I didn't think. I burst out of the cave into daylight and didn't stop until my legs gave out. When I finally collapsed, the forest had sound again. Birds, wind, life. The footprints were gone. The missing hiker was never found. The report listed it as exposure, presumed deceased. The cave was sealed again, this time with concrete and steel. Officially, nothing unusual occurred, but that was the first time the forest answered back when I stepped too close. And it would not be the last. I told myself that what I'd experienced was an anomaly, an isolated incident amplified by exhaustion, cold, and the echoing acoustics of a place never meant to be entered alone. That explanation held barely for a few weeks, long enough for paperwork to be filed, for supervisors to nod without really listening, for the cave to be marked as structurally unstable and quietly forgotten. But the forest has a way of returning what you try to bury. Winter crept in early that year. Snow settled into the higher elevations and pressed the trails into silence. Visitor numbers dropped. Patrols became lonelier, stretched thinner across miles of white and shadow. That was when the reports started, Not dramatic, not urgent enough to trigger alarms. Just odd. Footprints near closed campsites that didn't match any known animal. Deep impressions appearing overnight and vanishing by morning. Dogs refusing to leave their owners' sides, hackles raised, eyes fixed on empty tree lines. One older local came into the station with shaking hands and asked if we'd heard the walker again. I asked him what he meant. He stared at the floor for a long time before answering. "You're not supposed to ask it questions," he said. "You're supposed to leave." That was the second thing the forest took from me, my confidence in other people's silence. I started realizing that the quiet wasn't ignorance. It was restraint. These people weren't afraid of being laughed at. They were afraid of being heard. The next incident happened on a routine night patrol. Moonlight reflected off the snow so brightly I didn't need my flashlight. I was checking a remote service road when I saw movement ahead. Tall, slow, crossing between the trees with a gait that didn't hurry and didn't hesitate. I cut the engine. The world seemed to hold its breath with me. The shape stopped. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then it turned, not toward me, but slightly off, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I watched its outline resolve against the pale background. Broad shoulders, long arms hanging low, it stood upright in a way that felt practiced, not strained. I raised my binoculars with hands that no longer trusted themselves. The lenses shook just enough to blur the details, and part of me was grateful for that. What I could see was enough. The surface of it wasn't fur the way animals wear fur. It clung unevenly, matted in places, thinner in others, revealing skin beneath that looked too pale, too human in texture, if not in proportion. The smell reached me before the sound. Damp earth, old leaves, something coppery, like blood left too long in the open. It took one step forward. The snow didn't crunch. It compressed, silently, as if sound had been stripped from the moment. I lowered the binoculars and forced myself to breathe. Denial rose up again, familiar and tempting. I told myself it was a bear suffering from mange, standing oddly because of injury. I told myself low-light distorted perception. I told myself everything except the truth forming in my gut. The truth was this thing knew I was there. It turned its head then, slowly, deliberately, until its face, or what passed for one, angled toward my truck. I couldn't see eyes, not clearly, but I felt the weight of its attention settle on me like pressure. That was when it made the sound. Not a roar, not a scream. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the windshield and into my chest. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't curious. It was declarative, as if announcing presence rather than intent. I started the engine. The sound stopped instantly. I drove back to the station without looking in the rearview mirror. When I parked, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I sat there until dawn, watching the forest edge from behind glass and steel that suddenly felt very thin. In the days that followed, I began noticing patterns. The strange events clustered around certain areas, old trails no longer maintained, campsites closed decades ago, caves and sinkholes marked off after accidents that never quite made sense, places where the land folded inward on itself. Caves became a fixation for me. I started pulling old records, incident reports from before digital archives, missing persons, unexplained injuries, sudden closures. Again and again, caves appeared in the margins, not always listed as causes, but always nearby, as if the forest funneled its secrets into the earth and waited for us to lean close. My sleep suffered. When I did sleep, I dreamed of narrow spaces and breathing that wasn't mine. I'd wake with the sense of being watched, my instincts screaming while my rational mind lagged behind, still reaching for excuses. The breaking point came with a search and rescue call that should have been straightforward. A teenager, camping with friends, wandered off after dark. Panic set in when he didn't return. We found him just after sunrise, sitting at the mouth of a shallow cave, knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide and unfocused. He was alive, physically unharmed. Mentally, something had shifted. He wouldn't answer questions at first. He flinched when we raised our voices, even slightly. It wasn't until I crouched in front of him, keeping my tone low, that he finally spoke. "It breathed on me," he whispered. I asked him what did. He shook his head, tears cutting clean tracks down his dirt-streaked face. It knew my name. That confession lodged itself deep inside me. Fear for my own safety expanded into something heavier. Fear for others, for people who wandered into this forest trusting maps and signs that told only half the truth. We closed the area around that cave indefinitely. Official reason, unstable ground. Unofficial reason, I stood my ground for once, argued harder than I ever had, cited patterns no one wanted to acknowledge. At night, I began hearing the hum again, faint, distant, carried through the trees. Sometimes it came from the direction of the sealed cave, sometimes from places I hadn't yet marked. Each time it felt closer. The forest was no longer just a place I worked. It had become a presence, patient, observant, waiting for the moment when reason finally failed completely. And I was starting to understand that my confidence, the very thing that had once made me effective as a ranger, was eroding into something far more dangerous. The belief that I could still outrun what had already noticed me. By the time spring thawed the higher ridges, I had begun to measure my days not by patrol routes or incident reports, but by how close the forest felt. Some mornings, it held its distance, letting sunlight reach the ground, letting birds return as if nothing had ever been wrong. On those days, I almost believed I had imagined it all. Other mornings, the trees seemed to lean inward, their shadows overlapping in ways that made depth hard to judge, as if space itself had grown uncertain. I stopped hiking alone whenever I could avoid it. That decision embarrassed me more than I like to admit. Rangers are supposed to be self-reliant. Fear is something you manage, not something that manages you. Still, every instinct I had honed over years of backcountry work warned me that isolation was no longer neutral. It was an invitation. The third escalation came quietly, without spectacle. It began with a series of equipment failures. Trail cameras drained overnight, batteries found intact but cold to the touch, as if leached dry by something other than use. Radios cutting out at the same coordinates, always near limestone formations, always near areas where the earth dipped and folded. I logged it all, careful with my wording, sticking to facts. Patterns don't look like patterns until someone dares to draw a line between the dots. The line, for me, was drawn the day a fellow ranger didn't come back. He was younger than me, newly transferred, still carrying that mix of confidence and curiosity I remembered too well. He volunteered to check on a remote boundary marker after a storm. Simple task, half day at most. When his truck was found abandoned near a decommissioned trail, engine cold, door open, the old dread settled into my bones with practiced ease. Search protocols kicked in, teams assembled, dogs brought in. The forest once again went silent. I led a small group toward the area where his radio last pinged. As we moved deeper, I noticed the others growing uneasy, though none of them said it outright. Conversations dwindled. Eyes tracked shadows that moved too slowly to be wind. We found signs, branches bent at unnatural angles, scuffed earth where something heavy had paused. And there, near the base of a rock face, we found a cave entrance none of us remembered mapping. It was narrow, partially concealed by brush, as if it had learned how to hide. Cold air poured from it in a steady exhale. The dogs refused to go closer. I volunteered to take point, not because I was brave, but because a part of me needed to see if what haunted me would finally step fully into the light. Another part feared what would happen if someone else went instead. Inside, the cave widened unexpectedly, opening into a chamber tall enough to stand in comfortably. My headlamp illuminated old soot marks on the ceiling, signs of fires lit long ago. This place had been used, known, abandoned. We found his helmet first, placed gently on a stone ledge. That detail broke something in me. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just the careful arrangement of belongings echoing the hiker's pack from months before. A message, if you knew how to read it. I felt it then, the hum vibrating through the rock, through my teeth. The others felt it too. I saw it in the way they stiffened, the way their breathing faltered. From deeper in the cave, a shape shifted. This time, Denial didn't come. There was no room left for it. It emerged slowly, respecting the space as if aware of its size. Up close, the thing defied easy description. Its features suggested humanity in fragments. Hands shaped like ours but too large, joints bending with unsettling precision. Its face was shadowed, but when it tilted its head, I saw eyes reflecting the light back at us, not with animal panic or aggression, but with recognition. One of the rangers whispered a prayer. The thing inhaled, and the cave filled with that same resonant hum, louder now, layered with harmonics that made my vision blur. My fear shifted again, not sharp, not panicked, but profound. This was not a predator defending territory. This was a presence asserting itself. I raised my hands slowly, palms out. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or surrender. In that moment, images flooded my mind. Not visions, not hallucinations, but impressions. Of the forest before trails. Of people who came seeking refuge and found something else instead. Of caves used as thresholds, not shelters. The thing took a step closer, then stopped. Behind me, someone stumbled. The spell broke. The hum sharpened into something edged with warning. The thing retreated, melting back into shadow with unsettling grace. We didn't pursue. We didn't need to. We carried what we could, his helmet, his radio, and left the cave sealed behind us with temporary barriers that felt laughably insufficient. The missing ranger was never found. Another report filed, another family given a story that avoided the truth. That night, alone in my cabin, I confronted the weight I'd been carrying. The forest wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It operated by rules older than ours, and we were violating them simply by insisting everything be accessible, documented, controlled. The caves were not accidents. They were boundaries. I began marking maps differently. Not officially, those stayed clean, sanitized, but my own copies filled with symbols, notes, warnings. I steered hikers away when I could, closed trails under the guise of maintenance. Argued for expanded no-access zones. Some nights, I still heard the hum, distant but constant, like a reminder rather than a threat. Fear no longer came from the possibility of encountering it again. It came from the knowledge that I now understood just enough to know how fragile our safety really was, and how easily one misstep could pull someone into the dark places the forest kept for itself. I was no longer the confident protector I'd once been. I was a witness, a gatekeeper at best, and the forest, patient as ever, seemed content to let me live with that understanding. I stayed on after that when most people wouldn't have. Transfers were available. Early retirement was discussed quietly, as if my unease were contagious. I declined every option, not out of loyalty and not out of stubbornness, but because leaving felt like abandonment. Of the land, yes, but also of the truth I had finally stopped running from. The forest had not chosen me at random. It rarely does. The final reckoning did not arrive as an emergency call or a scream in the night. It came as an invitation, subtle and almost courteous, the way deep things often announce themselves. Late one evening in early fall, I found a symbol carved into the wooden railing outside the ranger station. 5 lines radiating from a central point, uneven, pressed deep enough that the wood had split. I knew immediately where it pointed. A cave system I had marked on my private maps, but never officially acknowledged. A place rumored among locals, avoided without explanation, absent from all modern surveys. I stood there for a long time, running my fingers over the grooves, feeling the vibration beneath them. The hum was faint but unmistakable, resonating through the wood, through my bones. That night, sleep never came. Instead, memories did. Every strange incident. Every silence. Every warning I had dismissed until it was nearly too late. I realized then that my greatest fear was no longer of dying in the forest, but of leaving without understanding my role in its story. At dawn, I packed light. No radio, no trail markers, just a headlamp, water, and the quiet acceptance that some journeys are not meant to be witnessed by others. The cave entrance lay hidden beneath a natural arch of stone and roots, as if the forest itself had grown a mouth. Cold air flowed outward, steady and calm, carrying that familiar scent of damp earth and age. I stepped inside without hesitation. The deeper I went, the more the cave opened, vast and cathedral-like, walls etched with markings layered over generations. Handprints, human and not, overlapping in patterns that suggested ritual rather than chaos. This was not a lair, it was a record. The hum grew stronger, resolving into something almost melodic. It filled the chamber, vibrating with intent. And then from the far end it emerged. Up close, stripped of fear's distortion, I saw it more clearly than ever before. Not a monster, not an animal. Something adjacent to us, shaped by the same pressures of survival, but guided by different rules. Its eyes held no malice, only depth, time, memory. I did not raise my hands this time, I lowered them. The understanding came not as words, but as certainty. These beings, whatever name people whispered for them, were not invaders. They were keepers. When humans first pushed into the wilderness, these caves became places of negotiation, of boundary setting. Some listened, others didn't. Those who crossed without respect simply disappeared from the story. I realized then that the disappearances were not punishments, they were corrections. The being stepped aside, revealing the back wall of the chamber. Etched there were maps, not of land, but of behavior. Symbols marking where humans could pass, where they could stay, and where they must never linger. The caves were not meant to be explored. They were meant to be acknowledged. I felt something loosen inside me. The constant tension, the fear sharpened by ignorance, finally had a shape to rest against. I had spent years trying to dominate the unknown when all that was required was humility. When I left the cave, the forest felt different, not safer, but balanced. The hum faded into the background, no longer a warning, but a presence that simply was. I returned to the station and filed my last report. It was brief, administrative, unremarkable. Then I turned in my badge. I still live near the forest. I walk its edges. I talk to locals who now speak more freely around me, as if recognizing that I finally understand the cost of knowing. I tell campers to respect closures, to trust their instincts, to remember that maps are not promises. Sometimes at night, when the wind moves just right through the pines, I hear it again, that low, resonant hum. It no longer fills me with panic. It fills me with responsibility. Because the forest does not belong to us. It never did. And the spirits of the pines do not hunt those who fear them. They remember those who forget. That is what I learned, standing at the edge of reason, listening to a world older than language answer back. The first thing I remember is the radio screaming my name from 6 feet underground. It wasn't static. It wasn't interference. It was my own voice, panicked, breathless, begging. Coming through the speaker, clipped to my shoulder while I stood alone beneath a clear sky, boots planted on soil that looked undisturbed for decades. I turned the radio off and left it off for 3 days after that. I've been a federal ranger for 19 years, long enough to know what the wilderness sounds like when it's honest. Wind through lodgepole pine has a rhythm. Elk calls carry a hollow echo at dusk. Even silence has a texture you learn to trust. What came out of that radio had weight. It pressed into my chest the way altitude sickness does, like something invisible leaning its full mass against your lungs. I took this job because I wanted rules. Lines on maps, trail markers, clear causes and clear outcomes. Before the service, I worked county search and rescue. I watched people vanish into bad decisions and bad weather, and I told myself that the forest wasn't cruel, just indifferent. That belief kept me functional. Then 5 years ago, a boy disappeared on my watch, Evan Miller, 8 years old. Day hike with his father along a ridge that had cell coverage and clear signage, weather mild, no predators reported in the area. We found the father alive 2 days later, barefoot and incoherent, insisting his son had stepped between the trees and gone somewhere else. He kept pointing at a stand of aspens no thicker than fence posts. There was nowhere to go. No drop-off, no cave, no prints after that point. The ground looked pressed flat like something heavy had been set down and lifted straight up. We never found Evan. I stayed in the service after that, which people think is strange. They assume guilt makes you leave. For some of us, It makes you stay. You start believing if you leave, whatever took them wins by default. The incident that broke me happened last winter, though the paperwork will say it was a routine boundary patrol with adverse conditions. The area doesn't have a name on most maps. It's a wedge of land between jurisdictions. National Forest to the west, decommissioned military testing grounds to the east. No trails, no campgrounds. Locals don't go there unless they have to. And even then, they don't linger. There are old mining claims from the 1930s scattered through the ridges, most collapsed, some sealed with concrete caps and warning placards no one checks anymore. The morning I went in, the temperature was wrong. January should have been brittle cold. Instead, heat shimmered low over the snowfields, bending the air so the trees looked like they were breathing. My truck thermometer read 28 degrees. My skin said something closer to late summer. I rolled the window down and smelled wet fur and burnt hair, faint but persistent, like a campfire someone had tried and failed to put out. I logged it as equipment error and kept driving. About 5 miles in, the radio crackled once, just enough to make me glance down, and then went quiet again. I remember thinking I should turn back. That was the rational moment, the one I keep replaying. But I had a list. I had coordinates to verify, and I had the old belief that if something didn't make sense, it was because I hadn't gathered enough data yet. The first disturbing thing was the sound beneath my boots. Snow has a language. Dry snow squeaks. Wet snow slushes. This snow hummed. A low vibration I felt through my soles more than heard, like standing over a distant generator. Every time I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it resumed, keeping pace with me. I knelt and pressed my gloved palm to the surface. The vibration slid away from my touch, like a muscle contracting under skin. I laughed out loud. I remember that. A sharp, brittle sound that didn't echo the way it should have. I told myself it was meltwater moving over rock. I stood and kept walking. Around midday, I found the cabin. It wasn't on any of our records. A single-room structure sunk halfway into the hillside, roof bowed under decades of snow load, door hanging open. The wood was gray and clean, no rot, no moss. It smelled like antiseptic and iron. Inside there was no dust, no animal droppings, no signs of habitation, just a metal chair bolted to the floor and deep grooves carved into the walls at shoulder height as if something had been dragged around the room in slow circles. I took photos. I tagged the GPS. I told myself I'd report it when I got back to the truck. That's when I heard Evan, not his name. His laugh. It came from the trees uphill, too close, too clear, the sound of a child catching breath between giggles. I stood very still, my rational mind cataloged possibilities. Audio hallucination under stress, memory intrusion, wind through branches. None of them fit. The sound moved. It shifted position as if someone were pacing just out of sight, careful to stay behind trunks too narrow to hide anything. I spoke without meaning to. Evan? The forest answered by going quiet. Not natural quiet. An absence so complete my ears rang. Then the ground vibrated harder, a pulse that traveled up my legs and settled behind my sternum, squeezing. My radio clicked on by itself. Help me, my voice said. I'm still here. I don't remember running, but I remember the taste of blood where I bit my tongue and the way the snow didn't slow me down. I remember shadows keeping pace with me no matter how I turned, silhouettes that leaned closer when I stared directly at them and snapped back into tree shape when I looked away. I reached a frozen lake I didn't recognize, a perfect oval cupped between ridges. The ice was black and mirror smooth. As I stepped onto it, heat rolled up from below, fogging my glasses. I wiped them clear and saw my reflection lag half a second behind my movements. When I raised my hand, it hesitated, then lifted its own in a different gesture, fingers spread wide, as if measuring my reach. Something brushed my ankle under the ice. I staggered back, heart hammering, and the lake spoke. Not with words, with pressure. A sense of attention so focused it felt like hands on my shoulders, turning me to face the center. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought, that if I went down there, I would not be alone. That there were others, pressed into the dark, listening, I retreated to the tree line and didn't stop until the ground rose and the air cooled, frost forming on my lashes in a season it didn't belong. I found the entrance at dusk, a concrete slab half buried in scree, no markings, no fence, just a seam where the earth had been cut and stitched back together. The hum beneath my feet was strongest there. I told myself I would mark it and leave. I told myself that I was not responsible for what I couldn't understand. I told myself a lot of things. The slab was warm to the touch, and from somewhere below it, something whispered my name with my son's voice. I should explain the voice. My son is alive. He's grown now, older than Evan ever got to be. When I hear his voice in my head, it's usually mundane, asking if I remembered to lock the truck, complaining about the taste of station coffee. What came from beneath that concrete slab was not memory. It was too precise. The cadence matched the way he spoke when he was 6, when he still rounded his vowels and dragged his feet on purpose. It used a nickname I hadn't allowed anyone to say since the divorce. I backed away until my calves hit stone and I nearly fell. The whisper followed, adjusting volume to distance, never raising itself to a shout. It didn't need to. It knew I was listening. I did not open the slab. That's the line I cling to. I marked the coordinates, snapped a final photo, and turned back toward the truck as the light bled out of the sky. Night fell faster than it should have, a thick, suffocating dark that swallowed my headlamp beam after 10 feet. The hum underfoot grew irregular, stuttering like a heart with a skipped beat. I realized I was being followed when my own footsteps started answering me. Not echoes. Deliberate delays. I would stop, hold my breath, count to 5. The steps would take one more pace after I'd gone still, crunching snow with careful restraint. When I turned, there was nothing. Just the same trees rearranged slightly, trunks closer together than before, branches interlaced like fingers. I told myself it was a mountain lion. They do that. They do that. They test. They pace. I reached for the flare on my belt and found it warm, almost hot, as if it had already been burning. The smell hit me next. Sulfur, sharp and unmistakable, layered over something sweet and rotten. Decay hiding under perfume. It seeped into my mouth, coated my tongue. I gagged and tasted iron. The trail, if you could call it that, narrowed into a cut between boulders. I didn't remember coming this way on the approach. I checked my GPS. The screen showed me standing still, arrow spinning in slow circles, unable to settle on a heading. My radio crackled to life again. "Don't go back," my voice said calmly. "You already tried that." That was when panic finally broke through the rational shell I'd been reinforcing all day. Panic is different from fear. Fear sharpens you. Panic dissolves structure. I ran again, stumbling through the cut, scraping my arms on stone that felt soft, almost yielding, like old leather. The temperature dropped so fast my breath crystallized mid-exhale, frost forming on my chest in the space of a few steps. The ground opened under me without warning. I fell maybe 10 feet, landed hard on packed earth, the impact driving air from my lungs in a sound that didn't echo. My headlamp flickered and steadied, illuminating a tunnel reinforced with timber blackened by age. Mining supports, hand-hewn close enough together that my shoulders brushed them. The walls were damp and smelled of wet fur and copper. I lay there longer than I should have, waiting for pain to bloom. It didn't. My body felt numb, insulated. When I pushed myself up, my hands left prints in the wall. The material gave slightly under my fingers, rebounding when I released it. The entrance behind me was gone. Not collapsed. Gone. The ceiling met the floor in a seamless curve of packed earth, no sign of the hole I'd fallen through. I told myself to conserve battery. I told myself to mark my path. I told myself the tunnel had to lead somewhere that intersected known maps. Each thought felt thin, insubstantial, like paper held up to fire. As I walked, the tunnel widened and narrowed without pattern. In places, it rose high enough that my light couldn't find the ceiling. In others, I had to crouch, feeling invisible cold press against my chest, squeezing until my vision sparkled at the edges. I heard breathing ahead of me, slow, deliberate, timed to my own inhales. When I stopped, it continued for 2 more breaths before adjusting. I reached a chamber where the air was warmer, heavy with moisture. The floor was smooth, worn by passage. In the center stood a ring of stones arranged too precisely to be natural. Inside the ring lay objects: a child's sneaker, a rusted compass, a plastic hair clip shaped like a butterfly, its wings snapped off. Evidence. Offerings. Or inventory. The walls were covered in marks, names scratched deep, overlapping, some so old they'd been worn nearly smooth. I recognized one. Evan Miller. I sank to my knees, the hum beneath me surging into a roar that rattled my teeth. The names pulsed, fresh cuts opening and closing, as if the wall itself were breathing. I pressed my palms to my ears and screamed, but the sound went nowhere. The chamber absorbed it, drank it in. "Stay," the voices said. Not one voice, but many, layered and intimate. "If you stay, it stops hurting." Figures stood at the edge of the light then, not fully formed. Suggestions of shoulders and heads, outlines that resolved only when I didn't look directly at them. They were motionless, patient. I understood with a sick clarity that they were what remained of the disappeared, what the land kept when it was finished with them. Not dead. Not alive. Held. I backed away until my spine hit the tunnel wall. My hand brushed something metal embedded there. A door. It was unmarked, flush with the stone, handle cold enough to burn. Military grade, heavy. A bunker door where no bunker should be. I don't remember deciding to open it. I remember the relief of movement, of choice, even as dread pooled in my gut. The door swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond it lay a corridor of poured concrete, lights flickering weakly overhead. The air smelled clean. Sterile. Somewhere deep inside, machinery hummed, matching the rhythm under my feet. On the wall to my right, stenciled letters peeled with age. Authorized personnel only, subsurface listening facility 3. I laughed then. A thin, hysterical sound that bounced back at me. Wrong. Listening. Of course it was listening. The land always was. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt like a hand settling between my shoulder blades. The corridor sloped downward, shallow enough to feel intentional, long enough to erase any sense of depth. The lights overhead were spaced at irregular intervals. Some flickered. Some glowed steady and warm, casting shadows that lagged behind my movements like after-images burned into the air. My boots echoed now, clean, sharp sounds that didn't belong to me. Every step felt recorded. I passed rooms sealed behind reinforced glass, observation bays. Inside them, chairs faced blank walls, headsets hanging like shed skins from metal hooks. In one room, a reel-to-reel tape recorder spun lazily, its tape already threaded, its reels turning though nothing was being recorded. The sound it made crawled under my skin, a dry whisper, like breath through cracked lips. I leaned close to the glass and saw scratches on the inside surface. Fingernail marks, dense and overlapping, all clustered at eye level. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing now and tried to get out. The radio on my shoulder crackled again, louder this time. I'd forgotten it was there. "You hear it now," my voice said. Not pleading. Certain. They always do, eventually. I tore the radio free and threw it down the corridor. It shattered against the concrete, the speaker popping once more before going silent. The hum beneath my feet did not change. If anything, it grew steadier, as if pleased. The next room was open. I smelled it before I saw it. Blood, old and sweet, layered with antiseptic. The room held a long table bolted to the floor, restraints at each corner, straps frayed from use. Above it, a web of cables descended from the ceiling, their ends fitted with sensors and needles. On the far wall, a chalkboard bore diagrams of the human ear, the brainstem, cross-sections of skulls annotated with tight, precise handwriting. At the bottom, someone had written, "Stimulus response consistent only in isolation." I understood then, in a way that bypassed fear and landed squarely in grief, that this place had been built to listen to something that did not speak when observed, something that needed absence, solitude, no witnesses. The land above had been chosen deliberately, a place where people vanished quietly, a place that could keep secrets. I found a locker room beyond that, rows of metal doors hanging open. Inside one locker sat a ranger's jacket, my jacket. Same serial number stitched inside the collar. Same tear along the left sleeve from a fall I took years ago. It was damp, warm to the touch, as if recently worn. I didn't put it on. I don't know if that was strength or instinct. The corridor ended at a control room overlooking a massive cavity carved out of stone. Not a natural cavern, too symmetrical. The walls were studded with speakers, microphones, and sensor arrays pointed inward toward a pit so deep my headlamp couldn't find the bottom. Cables descended into the dark like roots. As I stepped forward, the pit answered. Sound rose up, not loud, not sharp, but comprehensive. Voices layered over one another, some whispering, some crying, some laughing softly at jokes I couldn't hear the setup for. They weren't random. They followed patterns, rhythms, call and response, a language built from loss. Among them I heard Evan again, clearer now. He wasn't afraid. "It's warm here," he said. "They don't let us be cold." I fell to my knees. The concrete was warm, pulsing faintly. My hands vibrated against it, numb and alive at the same time. Images flooded my mind. Search grids laid out like scars across the forest, radios calling into nothing, parents aging overnight under fluorescent lights. I saw faces I recognized from missing persons boards. I saw my own, older, eyes hollowed by years of unanswered questions. "They don't want to keep us," my son's voice said gently. "They just don't want to be alone." Something shifted at the edge of the pit, not a creature, a movement of mass, like a tide turning. The sound intensified, harmonizing, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt the pull. The terrible seductive logic of it. No more searching, no more guilt, just staying, being held. I don't know what broke the spell. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the memory of Evan's father, barefoot in the snow, screaming at trees that didn't answer. I staggered to my feet and scanned the control panels lining the room. Most were dead. One still glowed. A simple interface with a single slider labeled amplification. It was set to maximum. I slammed my palm down on the emergency cutoff beneath it. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The hum became a scream, not in sound but in sensation. The concrete cracked under my boots, fissures racing outward. The pit convulsed, shadows boiling up its sides. The voices rose in protest, in pain, in rage. The lights exploded overhead, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the sickly glow of my headlamp. Something surged upward from the pit, not fully visible, not comprehensible, but vast. The pressure of it drove me back, invisible cold crushing my chest until I couldn't breathe. I felt hands, many hands, grasp at my legs, my waist, desperate, clinging. "Don't leave," they begged. "Don't make us quiet again." I ran. The bunker was coming apart around me, alarms wailing now, red lights flashing sporadically. Corridors warped, angles shifting, doors appearing where there had been none before. I followed the slope upward, lungs burning, heart threatening to tear itself apart. Behind me, the sound of pursuit was not footsteps but vibration, the land itself reasserting control. I burst through a door and fell into night. Cold hit me like a wall. Real cold. The kind that bites and grounds you in your body. I lay there gasping, stars wheeling overhead, snow biting into my cheek. The concrete slab lay beside me, cracked now, steam rising from its seams. The hum was gone. Dawn found me wandering the tree line, disoriented, radio dead, GPS shattered. I was found 2 days later by another patrol, hypothermic and incoherent. I told them about the bunker, the pit, the voices. They told me there was nothing there. Satellite imagery showed undisturbed ground. No slab, no heat signatures. My photos were gone from my camera. The coordinates led to an empty ridge overlooking a frozen lake that locals swore had always been there. They put me on administrative leave. Psychological evaluation. Early retirement paperwork slid across a desk with practiced sympathy. I don't go into the woods anymore. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and the ground outside my house settles, I feel it, a faint vibration under my feet, and from somewhere very far away, or very close, I hear a radio crackle. I tried to tell myself it was over. That's what the doctors said. Acute stress response. Hallucinations consistent with guilt fixation and prolonged exposure to isolation. They used careful language, the kind designed to close doors without appearing to. The service took my badge quietly, no ceremony, no apology. I signed forms I didn't read and handed over equipment that still smelled like snow and antiseptic. For a while, the vibrations stopped. I moved inland, far from tree cover, to a place where the ground was hard and predictable. Concrete, rebar, utility lines humming with known currents. I slept with the lights on. I slept with the radio off. When I dreamed, it was of normal things, missed calls, empty trailheads, maps that folded the wrong way. I could function. Then the disappearances started again. Not near me. Spread out. A hiker in Arizona who stepped off trail to relieve himself and never returned. A snowmobiler in Montana whose machine was found idling, helmet resting neatly on the seat. A surveyor in Nevada who radioed in that the ground was warm and loud before going silent. Different jurisdictions, different agencies. Same phrasing buried in the reports if you knew where to look. No signs of struggle, no natural explanation. Search suspended due to environmental risk. I stopped reading after the third one. It didn't help. I could feel it anyway. A low anticipation coiling under my skin, like pressure before a storm. When I stood barefoot on my kitchen tile at night, the vibration returned, not constant, but testing. Testing. A pulse every few seconds, just enough to make me aware of my weight, my contact with the ground. It learned my schedule. The voices came back gradually, never all at once, never loud. They used proximity instead of volume, a whisper behind my ear while I brushed my teeth, a breath under my floorboards when I lay awake at 3 a.m. They didn't say my name at first. They talked among themselves, fragments of conversations I half recognized, search briefings, campfire jokes, the bureaucratic language of reports stripped of hope. I installed carpet, then thicker padding, then I stopped sleeping on the first floor. It didn't matter. The worst part was how reasonable it sounded. Not pleading, not threatening, explaining. Patient, as if I were the one being unreasonable for not understanding. The land didn't hunt, it said. It archived, it listened, it remembered what we tried to forget. Places like the bunker weren't prisons, they were interfaces, ways to translate what the ground had always known into something we could almost comprehend. Isolation was the key, always had been. One witness diluted the signal, 2 created interference. Alone, a person resonated. Their thoughts slowed. Their boundaries softened. The land leaned in. I started walking at night again, despite myself. Short distances at first, around the block, down empty streets where the asphalt still held the day's heat. I could feel the difference between artificial ground and living earth now. Soil responded, it adjusted, it met my steps halfway. I found myself driving without fully remembering getting in the car. The night I returned to the forest, it wasn't to the same place. That's important. I want that on record. It didn't need me to go back there. It just needed me somewhere quiet enough. The trailhead was unmarked, barely a pull-off. No signage, no warnings. The air smelled clean, cold where it should have been cold. For a moment, standing there with my flashlight cutting a thin line through the dark, I almost laughed at myself. I almost turned around. Then I heard someone walking ahead of me. Measured steps, careful placement, a professional's gait. "Hey," I called automatically, "Ranger service, you're off trail." The figure stopped just within the edge of my light. It was me. Not a reflection, not a trick of shadow. Older, thinner, uniform faded and torn, eyes too bright. He looked tired in the same way I felt tired. He smiled with recognition. "You took the long way," he said. My voice, worn smooth by repetition. I knew then what the bunker had been for. Not containment, continuity. When someone stayed, when they accepted, it didn't end them. It recorded them, copied the pattern, used it where needed. A ranger's voice carried authority. A child's laugh carried trust. A loved one's tone carried obedience. The forest didn't just keep screams, it kept us. I don't remember walking deeper. I remember the sensation of the ground warming under my boots, the vibration aligning with my pulse until I couldn't tell which was which. I remember the relief of not arguing anymore, of letting the logic complete itself. I remember stopping at a place where the trees grew too close together and realizing they were standing like that on purpose. I woke up in my bed the next morning. That's the part that should scare you most. No missing time, no confusion, just a faint ache in my chest and dirt under my fingernails. When I stood, the vibration was gone. The house felt inert, empty. I thought briefly that maybe I'd imagined everything after all. Then I found the radio on my kitchen table. It wasn't mine, different model, older, scratched. The battery was dead, but the casing was warm. There are no more voices now, not because it's stopped, but because it doesn't need to speak to me anymore. I feel it when I walk near parks, when I stand on untreated ground. I feel the way it leans, the way it listens back. Sometimes I catch myself adjusting my pace to match something just out of sync with me. Sometimes I know exactly where to step to avoid a hollow that isn't marked on any map. I don't report disappearances anymore. I document suitability. If you are hearing this because it was found, because someone decided it should be recorded, understand this. The wilderness is not empty. It is not indifferent. It is attentive in ways we are not equipped to endure. Some places don't want visitors, they want replacements.